Welcome back, students. This is Module 2.4.4, Light. We're going to talk about the source of energy for photosynthesis and also a little bit how light is harvested. So we're going to be considering light, as I said, and you should recognize that light is only one portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. The electromagnetic spectrum is energy which is all around us. If you turned on a radio right now, it would likely receive a signal. And radio waves, like visible light, is part of this electromagnetic spectrum, which is energy that's all around us. This energy is in the form of waves. So it's energy in wave form. Now, light actually has a dual nature. It can be a particle, like a photon, or a wave. And to really understand this better, I'm going to make you take a physics class because we don't have time to discuss that seeming anomaly. So if you look at the diagram I just put up here on the corner of the slide, it talks about an attribute of energy in waveform called wavelength. And you can get the idea that wavelength is just the distance from the top of one wave to the top of the next. And you can see the electromagnetic energy on the top has shorter wavelength, and on the bottom here it has longer wavelength. Now, as it turns out, that there's a correlation between wavelength and energy. The longer the wavelength, the lower the energy. The shorter the wavelength, the higher the energy. Now, visible light is only a tiny portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. I'm putting some units here, some measurements. I'm not going to ask you if visible light goes from 400 nanometers to 740 nanometers, but I'm just reporting this, putting it up here. So do not memorize the range nor even the unit, that a nanometer is 1/billionth of a meter, 10 to the negative 9 meters. You don't have to remember that. But I do want you to remember some other things about the electromagnetic spectrum. Here is the electromagnetic spectrum, and there are 6 types of electromagnetic energy. And you can see radio waves over here with the longest wavelength and the lowest energy, and over here gamma rays with the shortest wavelength and the highest energy. And then below visible light in terms of wavelength is infrared, which means below red, and UV, ultraviolet. Ultra means above violet. And so then right in here we see visible light, and then X-rays are there. So I want you to really know the 6 types of electromagnetic energy and know which has longer wavelengths and has more energy and how they fit. So you should kind of know that order, if you will. You should also know the visible light spectrum. And so this is where I get to introduce you to a good friend in just a moment. But first we want to tell you what happens when light strikes an object. 3 things can occur. That light can be absorbed, it can be transmitted, or reflected. The last 2, transmitted and reflected, are kind of seen as the same because the energy comes out as opposed to being absorbed and staying inside. And it is now that I get to introduce you to my good friend Roy G. Biv. And of course this stands for the letters of the visible light spectrum. And so you should know that Roy G. Biv stands for red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. So red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. These are the colors of a rainbow, or of white light that goes through a prism. And so there we go. So you should definitely remember that. And also, you need to be aware of how colors are named. Colors are named according to the wavelength that is reflected or transmitted, that comes off. Okay, so sunlight consists of white light, all the colors of the visible light spectrum. Roy G. Biv goes in, hits a tree, and what is reflected to our eye is green, and that's because green was not absorbed. And so Roy Biv was absorbed and G was reflected, and so you see green. And to drive this home, I have a table here that you should understand fully. If we talk about an object such as a white rabbit, remember white is all the colors of the visible light spectrum. What is absorbed is none, and what is reflected is all. Roy G. Biv. If you have a black dog, like my good old dog Jake, he just died in January, but he was a black lab mix, and he was a great dog. But he was his black fur absorbed all the colors, Roy G. Biv, and reflected none. Now, a red ball would absorb Roy G. Biv and reflect red. The color that goes to the eye, that is reflected to the eye, is what we name the color of an object as. And of course, most importantly to our topic here, and as illustrated on the previous slide, a green leaf absorbs Roy Biv and reflects green, or G, if you want to use only a single letter. I told you earlier when we were doing the history module, the history of photosynthesis module, we would probably talk about one more historical experiment. And here that experiment is. This was done by Thomas Engelmann in the late 1800s, 1882 or so. And it was really a very, as I've said here, clever experiment. This rectangle you see here represents a microscope slide. This strand is a filament of green algae, and the spectrum that you see across it was created by shining a white light, through a prism. And so what it essentially did was allow Engelmann to figure out what parts of the visible light spectrum are used by plants. And the little black dots that you're seeing here are bacteria that require oxygen, and you can see that they concentrate where most oxygen is being produced. And this is actually a graph that's been drawn on there. That wasn't done in the actual experiment, but just for this figure, it's showing kind of the action potential of chlorophyll. And so this is the result that Thomas Engelmann got, was that green plants especially prefer light in the indigo and violet range and in the red range. And of course, green, the area that's not absorbed because it's reflected to the eye, isn't used by plants at all, which makes a lot of sense. That's why plants are green. And so it's very instructive, this experiment, and very early, and as I said earlier, very clever. So it's a kind of a cool experiment, I think. This is simply showing the absorption spectrum of visible light by chlorophyll A. Now, this is the first time I've mentioned chlorophyll A, specifying that there's a particular type of chlorophyll. But look at those peaks, boy, whoosh, the red and then the violet. So we can also talk about other types of pigments besides chlorophyll. In addition to chlorophyll A, chloroplasts have other pigments like chlorophyll B and accessory pigments that are called carotenoids, I mentioned before, and two types of carotenoids, which is a category. Specific pigments are carotene, which is orangey color, and xanthophyll, which is yellow. Xantho actually means yellow and phyll means leaf. Like chlorophyll means green leaf, xanthophyll means yellow leaf. And accessory pigments have different absorption spectra than chlorophyll A, and this increases the efficiency of light harvest. Accessory pigments will often typically absorb green, blue, indigo, violet, and reflect red, orange, yellow, and especially keratin and xanthophyll we're talking about here, not so much chlorophyll B. Now, you might wonder why when you look at a leaf, it looks green if there are yellow and orange pigments. And it's just because there is so much chlorophyll that all of that green pigment masks the less common yellow pigments of xanthophyll and orange pigments of carotene. And so it's almost like paint. If you just have a little bit of yellow and a little bit of orange in a bunch of green, you won't see it. Of course, the function of accessory pigments is to increase the efficiency of the light harvest, and they absorb wavelengths that chlorophyll A does not, and then they actually transmit that energy to chlorophyll. And so here we can see in the absorption spectrum on the left, we can see the chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, and notice they have different peak absorptions. And here's beta carotene. This one, phycoerythrin, is kind of a rare one. This is actually a pigment that's found in a red algae from the ocean. Kind of interesting. If you ask me in lab, I can show you that red algae. It's kind of cool. One other thing to consider when we're talking about colors of leaves is the change of color in the fall and the autumn. Leaves change a beautiful color. And this is because trees lose their leaves, deciduous trees lose their leaves, and before they do that, they absorb the chlorophyll back, because chlorophyll is pretty difficult to make. It has a magnesium atom right at the center, and in order to maintain their store of magnesia, they absorb the green pigments back. And then you can see the underlying accessory pigments. In this case, it looks like a lot of keratin is in the leaves of this maple tree. And so it's very interesting. Now, consider another question with regard to pigments and harvesting energy with pigments. And that was what would happen if light harvest was 100% efficient. What color would plants be if all of Roy G. Biv was absorbed and none was reflected? Well, plants would be the same color as my good old dog Jake. They'd be the same color as a famous forest in Germany. That black forest, of course. There it is. Oh, yeah, that's the black forest. Not a photographic trick at all. That's the actual black forest. No, of course it's not. Then the black forest, of course, is not black. But if plants absorbed all wavelengths, they would be black. And, of course, the black forest is simply called the black forest because of its density and the depth of shadows, the deep shadows that are found there. Now, we don't really know why plants are green and not black. I mean, more efficiency is often selected for, and it has been suggested there are two hypotheses. One has something to do, and it's kind of a vague hypothesis in my mind. I don't really, it doesn't gel and hold together, it doesn't hang together very well. And that is the fact that plants did evolve first in water, and at different depths there are different coefficients of extinction of different wavelengths of light. And so it might have something to do with that in some vague way that I don't fully comprehend at this time. But a more, I think, substantiated hypothesis is that green was just in between the little mechanisms in the cell that could absorb it. The energy of green was in between. And it kind of fell through the cracks almost, if you will. And so those are the two hypotheses, I suppose. And that will conclude this module about light and light harvest.